Over on Purple Insider, a new Vikings history video is out about the time that Bud Grant, during a game against the Detroit Lions, only showed up to the game 5 minutes before kickoff. Click the card in the upper right corner to watch. And now, on with our feature presentation. Bruce Coslet's tenure as the head coach of the New York Jets was, shall we say, a mixed bag with a lot more negative than positive, and that's putting it lightly. On one hand, he guided the Jets to the playoffs in 1991, as they made it for the first time since 1986, and he made the Jets somewhat respectable during the early 1990s after they were the laughingstock of football during the end of the 1980s under head coach Joe Walden. On the other hand, oh man, there was a lot not to like about him. There are certain guys that are great coordinators that are completely unfit to be head coaches, and Coslet was one of them. He was a great offensive coordinator with the Cincinnati Bengals, got the most out of Boomer Esiason, and had some innovative strategies that helped lead his team to success, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. But as a head coach, yeah, the 47-77 record speaks for itself, as well as his questionable in-game management, particularly during a 1992 game against the San Francisco 49ers, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. However, while Bruce Coslet's tenure with the Jets was not very good, outside of one playoff appearance where no one else in the AFC wanted to make the playoffs that year, and while there were many questionable moves that Coslet made, the one we're going to talk about is one that you may not have heard of before, but it was really bad, and showed just how out of his element Coslet was as the man in charge. Because prior to a 1990 game against the Indianapolis Colts, he made an absolutely bizarre decision when it came to deciding who was going to be on his active roster, and who was going to be a healthy scratch. And not only did said decision backfire in rather spectacular fashion, but the explanation that Coslet gave afterwards was so baffling that honestly, if you fired him on the spot right afterwards for just how stupid this was, I don't think anyone would have batted an eye. Because this is the story behind one of the stupidest roster management moves in Jets history. Before I talk about the decision in question, and Coslet's comments about said decision, we need some context to understand just who this man right here is that you're going to be watching a ton of. There were a lot of very good returners throughout the latter half of the 1980s that you always had to keep an eye out on if you were in special teams coverage, because if they found a hole, they could make the most of it. And this man, Joseph Ray Townsell, otherwise known as Jo-Jo Townsell, was one of those guys. Because throughout the second half of the 1980s, the former third-round pick out of UCLA and the former USFL player established himself as one of the most feared punt returners in all of football, and established himself as a key part of New York's special teams unit. It's funny, because Townsell didn't return a single punt in college, but at the NFL level, not only did he return a ton, but he was awfully good at this, despite this being a relatively new skill set. Over the second half of the 1980s, from 1985 to 89, Townsell returned 110 punts, and not only had 2 touchdowns, but averaged an incredible 11 yards per return. During the 1988 season in particular, Townsell was so good that the publication Pro Football Weekly named him the top punt returner in the AFC. And it's not too hard to see why, seeing as that season, he averaged 11.7 yards per return, which was the 3rd best total in the league. At one point, his 91-yard punt return for a touchdown against the Seattle Seahawks during a 1987 battle was the 2nd longest punt return for a touchdown in Jets history, and the longest that they had as an NFL team. And by the time Townsell's career was done, he had firmly established himself as quite possibly the greatest punt returner in the over 30-year history of the Jets franchise, as he had the 2nd most punt return yards in team history, was one of just 2 players to return multiple punts for a touchdown, and had the record for most yards per return by any punt returner with at least 50 returns. Today, he still holds the franchise record for most yards per return by any punt returner with at least 100 returns. By this point in franchise history, only 3 times had a player on the Jets fielded at least 30 punts in a season, had over 380 punt return yards, and averaged over 11 yards per return. Those 3 times were Bruce Harper in 1977, and then Jo-Jo Townsell twice, doing this in back-to-back seasons in 1987 and 1988. Townsell had firmly entrenched himself as a special teams legend in New York, which he still is to this day. When 1990 rolled around, was Townsell still the same guy that he was in 1987 and 1988, when he might have been the top punt returner in football? No, and no one would deny that, especially since he missed some time that season with an injury. Having said that, he was still a very good punt returner that was in that upper echelon of return men. He had quite a few games that year where he averaged at least 12 yards per return, and during the 1990 season, he averaged over 9 yards per return, at a time when the league-wide average was 8.4 yards per return. Townsell was roughly a full yard above the league-wide average, and among players with at least 16 returns in 1990, or an average of 1 return per game, Townsell actually had the 9th highest yards per punt return average in the league out of a possible 26 guys to qualify. So you're looking at a guy that was in the top third of the league in this category. And I think everyone would admit that special teams is a big deal. If you can get a spark out of that unit, you're going to find yourself in a pretty good spot, because that third phase of the game, even if they play the least, is so important. And Townsell was as good as anyone in one aspect of that third phase: returning punts, making something out of nothing, and bursting through the hole and making life for the opposing team a living nightmare if he got ahead of steam. The 1990 season was not good for the Jets, as entering Week 15, going into their battle in the AFC East against the Indianapolis Colts on December 16th, they found themselves at 4-9 with an offense in the bottom quarter of the league, a 4-game losing streak, with one of those losses being a 17-14 loss to the Colts in Indy, and with no shot whatsoever at the playoffs, as they were mathematically eliminated. However, despite that, you would think that Townsell would be penciled in as the punt returner, right? He was not the reason, or was not any reason close to why the Jets were struggling, and he was in that upper echelon of returners, as mentioned before. This seemed like a lock to have the 30-year-old return man back there to field punts for this game, especially because it was a windy day at Giants Stadium, which is one of the toughest stadiums in the league to field punts in as is, especially around this time of year, when the weather is cold and the winds are blowing. Townsell knows the stadium like the back of his hand, and knows how to field balls in that environment. The 19-mile-per-hour winds on this day were intimidating for most returners, but were child's play for a veteran like Townsell, who had grown accustomed to the stadium. However, despite all of that, this man right here, Jo-Jo Townsell, was made inactive for the game. It wasn't because of wanting to give a youngster like Terrence Mathis a chance, although Mathis would be the one taking his spot for this game. It wasn't because of a lingering injury or something that came up. It wasn't because of a dispute that he had with his head coach, Bruce Coslet, or because Townsell disobeyed the team rules, or showed up late, or anything along those lines. Nope. Coslet just decided to make Townsell, his veteran punt returner who was still playing at a high level in 1990, a healthy scratch for this game. And I'm sure this decision wouldn't come back to bite Coslet and company in any way whatsoever, right?
But the winds changed directions in the Meadowlands. Ron Stark punting. Terrence Mathis. 12th of never on this attempted
Of course that happened. Yep, the Jets, holding on to a 14-3 lead, allowed a touchdown after Terrence Mathis, the rookie who's not the usual punt returner, muffed the punt, and it was recovered by Indy, leading to Jeff George throwing a 23-yard touchdown pass to cut the deficit to 14-10. completely flipping the momentum of the game on its head, and eventually leading to the Colts winning by a final score of 29-21. It was another ugly game in what was an ugly season for the Jets. A lot of things went wrong for the Jets on this day. They couldn't stop Eric Dickerson on the ground whatsoever, as he had 117 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns on over 4 yards per carry, while picking up over 160 yards from scrimmage. They didn't force any turnovers, as the defense couldn't steal any possessions. The offensive line had its struggles in pass protection, allowing 3 sacks. However, the play that summed up New York's inefficiency and ineffectiveness was that Mathis muff punt, which changed the entire complexion of the game. And unsurprisingly, afterwards, Bruce Coslet was asked about why he made Townsell a healthy scratch, seeing as it likely cost the Jets the game. And folks, you're not going to believe his explanation. Want to know why this man right here, Jo-Jo Townsell, didn't play this game and why Coslet scratched him? As Coslet said, we had Townsell penciled in only to do punt returns. We have other wide receivers who do more things on special teams. He then added, I hate to say this about him, because he's a fine football player, but he was the least necessary for that particular week. He doesn't do anything on special teams other than return punts. I'm sorry, what? That's your explanation? You made your punt returner inactive because he's a punt returner? Isn't that, I don't know, his literal job? You decided not to play Townsell, even though he was the primary punt returner and was awfully good at it, because all he would have done during the game is return punts, even though returning punts is a part of the game, and he's likely going to be touching the ball 5 times with a chance to flip the field? I really cannot believe that. Imagine if, next season, the Jaguars deactivated Jamal Agnew for their game because in the eyes of Doug Peterson, he wasn't going to be used at receiver for the game, and all he does anyways is return kicks, so he's useless. Imagine if the Bears said, Devin Hester? I mean, he's really good at what he does, but that's all he knows how to do, so we're not going to make him active. You can even apply this logic to other sports. Imagine if the New York Yankees said, don't get me wrong, this Mariano Rivera fella is really good, but we have him penciled in only for the 9th inning. We have other pitchers on our team who can go the 9th, as well as innings 1 through 8. So he's the least necessary, and they just left him off their playoff roster. Imagine if Team USA prior to the 2014 World Cup said, Tim Howard's a really good goalkeeper, but that's the only position he knows how to play, so we're not going to take him to Brazil. Coslet, by making that decision, and by making those asinine comments, essentially said, special teams is an irrelevant part of the game, and if you're only good at one thing, you're not going to play. He basically said, we'll sacrifice ourselves with returning punts on a windy day because punt returns are not that important and don't happen that often, even though everyone involved with football knows that this is not true, and that this is a blatant misconstruction of the way that the game is played. If you're really good at something, to the point where you specialize in it, guess what? Most coaches would consider that to be an asset. Most coaches would love a punt returner like Jo-Jo Townsell on their team. But not Bruce Coslet. Not freaking Bruce Coslet, who thought that a man who was really good at returning punts wasn't good enough, left him off the roster because of it, and then paid the price and found out the hard way that, oh yeah, punt returns are kind of important. And the move makes even less sense when you realize that after the loss, Coslet complained that the team didn't have enough veteran leadership, yet not only benched the veteran, but benched the veteran who was single-handedly responsible for calling a team meeting while the Jets were in the middle of their losing streak. Make it make sense, I beg of you. And for what it's worth, Townsell said that he was surprised by being named inactive, but accepted it for the good of the team. However, I think it's safe to say, knowing what we know now, that based on how the game played out, that this was not for the good of the team at all. This hurt the team way more than it helped it. So what's the moral of the story here? Punt returns are important. The return element of the game is an important part of the game, especially on a windy day, when you absolutely need someone back there who can field the ball. And to bench a punt returner who's good because he's a punt returner and that's it, let's be honest, doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. Neglecting an entire component of special teams that comes up quite a few times a game doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. Benching your starter because he's only good at the position that he starts doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But on this December day in 1990, Bruce Coslet thought otherwise and paid the price. Because his decision not to play Jo-Jo was a big no-no. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.